Hello and welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to part 2 of the air suspension video, and with it being part 2 you've probably guessed that fitting the new air compressor in the first video didn't work. The air suspension still isn't working, the car is sat really low. Now the odd thing is that the air compressor does work, so when the car is turned on you can hear the air compressor working, but it makes no difference to the ride height at all. So I think what I'm going to do next is head over to the diagnostic tool and see if there's any clues. So I can hear the air compressor just fine. Now what's interesting is the gallery pressure is a lot lower than what it was with the original air compressor on. The original air compressor was giving it about 1400 kilopascals, it should be around about 1600, and I'm getting nowhere near. It's increasing ever so slightly from 400. That's it, it's tapped out. So this to me makes me think it's probably one of two things, because the original air compressor did have a leak on it, on one of either the inlet or the outlet on the red connector. It was bubbling up. So it did have a leak on it, but it did build up plenty of pressure. It just gushed out. I seem to have the opposite problem. I've got hardly any pressure really, but it is coming out a lot slower. So is that the air compressor, which was off eBay, could be trash and then it just isn't capable of building up the necessary pressure, or have I introduced a new leak somewhere by faffling around with air hoses and stuff? So I think what I'll do is I'll spray all the air hoses with my soapy solution and then start it up again and see if there's any leaks as a starter for 10. So having found no air leaks whatsoever from the air compressor, any of the air lines around that midsection, or the valve block itself, I then started to undo everything so I could get the valve block off. Started with the electrical connectors and then the air line that goes into the blue push fit connector onto the air compressor. And then I started with the Voss connectors, the two on the right hand side. It was much easier to start with the bottom one and then the top one. There is an electrical connector on the left hand side. You can just see the orange bit there. You just press that in and pull that out, and then you can actually remove the valve block itself from the chassis rail by just pulling it away. There's just a couple of 3 rubber grommets on the back there, and what that does is it gives you better access to the air line that goes into the top of the valve block. It's still a little tight, but it is much easier with it away from the chassis rail. Right, so this one looks a little bit different to what I was expecting. There's 3 valve blocks on the car. The front and the rear, I think, are the same. They've got 3 solenoids in each. This just has the one. I'm guessing this controls the flow of air from the air reservoir. Now, one thing I've noticed when I was taking it all apart was that there's this white residue in all the fittings, which isn't good. And what can happen is, this is the old air compressor, and in this chamber here should be this desiccant material. And all this does is a bit like silica gel, I guess. It absorbs moisture, so that the air going into the system is free of moisture. It doesn't corrode the system. But this stuff can break down over time, and this white powdery residue can end up in the system. And that's bad because that can stick up the solenoids. So I'm going to take this apart, clean it all up, and hopefully, if nothing else, prolong the life of this part. But hopefully it might solve the problems I'm having. Now with the valve block off the car, it gives me an opportunity to replace a pretty knackered air line that attached to it. So a new one did come with the new air compressor, so I removed the old Voss connector from the old line, which was in pretty good condition, and fitted it to the new air line, being sure to put the olive back on there. So with that all back together, I'm going to put this back on the car. I don't think it's going to make any difference, but we'll give it a go. So with the valve block off the car, it does give me an opportunity to have a look at the air reservoir as the other end of the air line is disconnected. Now it's actually held in relatively simply. There are 2 bolts on the right hand side and there are 2 bolts on the left hand side and a couple of tabs to keep it in place. Now the first bolt came out relatively straightforward, no problems there, but the second bolt, now both bolts are a little bit corroded, but the head of the second bolt just pretty much rounded off. Now fortunately I do have a set of these Irwin bolt grip remover sockets, and they're actually rifled on the inside, and the metal is really quite hard. They fit straight onto a socket, and you don't need to hammer them on or anything like that, just a little bit of inward pressure, a little bit of jiggling about, and if you keep the pressure on, they absolutely bite onto the head of a bolt. And I love these things, they get you out of so much trouble, and the good thing about them is that they're actually machined on the side, so you can actually get a spanner on them if it gives you better access. And using those, the bolt came straight out. On the left hand side there's just a couple of bolts and a little metal tab. They came out relatively simply, no dramas there. Now the reason the reservoir doesn't just fall out is that there are a couple of metal tabs holding it in place, so with some support underneath so it doesn't just fall to the floor, use the flathead screwdriver, just prise that out and encourage it to come out a little bit, and then I use some wood to get a little bit more height, because there is still an air line on the top of the air reservoir that needs to be undone, so you don't want to be leaving it hanging from there. So it's just another Voss connector with a few turns that comes straight out, and then it can rest on the wood long enough for you to reposition yourself to get your hand on it, and then you can remove the wood and then slide it to the right hand side and lift it out. So using a spare piece of airline and the Voss connector on the end, attach that to the air reservoir, and then attach the other end to the air compressor in the garage and filled it up with as much air as possible, and then crimped the end with some mold grips to stop any air coming out. I sprayed the whole thing with a soapy solution, really doused it, and had a good look around to see if I could see any air bubbles or any leaks coming out of it anywhere, and I couldn't see a thing. There was no evidence of it. So I did leave it for a good long while, a good few hours. I came back to it and then tried to catch any air coming out of it. If there's air in there, it should be okay. Right, just to check where we're currently at. So I've taken off the air compressor and replaced it. That should be fine. I've taken off the air reservoir and I've put pressure in that from my garage air compressor and it holds. So that's okay. I've taken off the centre valve block, taken it apart, cleaned it up, and then put all that back together. Now I have made this bit of a tool on the lathe which can accept the fitting from an airline from the garage air compressor, but then one of the push fit connections that are on the car, or the Voss connectors that are throughout the air suspension system, so that I can put pressure into the car. It's not as much as what the Range Rover would generate, but it should be enough to find leaks. So I've tested the lines all around the centre there, and the lines that go to the front valve block and the rear valve block, and it was holding pressure fine. So I can only think that the valve blocks at the front and the rear default to a closed position, and when the car starts it knows it's low, it tries to put pressure into the whole system to raise the car, and then does that by opening the valves in the front and rear blocks. Only then can it find a leak either in the line that goes to the left or right rear, or the left and right front strut. That's the theory anyway. So I'm going to take apart the rear valve block, which is actually kind of tricky to get to, and then I'm going to test the lines from the left and right strut, and hopefully I find a leak. So the first thing we see here is a bit of an electrical connector, which should just pop down. So now on the back here there should be probably about 3 lugs, like rubber grommets that hold it to the chassis. It should just pop off. Yeah. Just like that. That's the easy bit. Now there are 3 lines attached to this. There's the one that comes into the valve block from the air compressor, and then there's one that go, well there's 2 that go out, one to the left strut, one to this right strut, left strut. And they are keeping that held there. I can't pull it any further this way, so I'm going to just disconnect it really as best as I can. I think I'll start by taking off this bottom line. Alright, so that's the bottom line off. Oh, I can actually bring this a bit further this way, but it's still not enough. There's still 2 lines on the very back of this valve block. And that's the other 2 lines off. I wish I could give you some pearls of wisdom on the best way to get that off, but that was literally 1/4 of a turn, turn the spanner over, another 1/4 of a turn, rinse and repeat until it's off. Ooh. You can tell there's more valves and stuff going on in this one because it's quite a bit heavier than the centre one, but let's take it apart and have a look.
So after removing the valve block, stripping it down, cleaning it up, putting it all back together, I reinstalled it back into the car, which took an absolute age. It was far worse putting it back in than it was getting it out. I tested the airlines to the left and right air struts and I couldn't find any leaks. So I flipped the car around to give better access to the front valve block.
So I've spun the car around because it's not made any difference to the ride height. So I'm going to jack this side up, get this wheel off, and then try and tackle the front valve block, take that off, clean it all up, check the lines, make sure there's no leaks, and then try again. So all around the wheel arch lining is a combination of fasteners. So we've got some Phillips head screws and we've got these plastic fasteners as well. So I think I'm going to undo the front half, which should be enough to peel that back and then get access to the valve block. So I've removed the entire wheel arch liner to give me better access to this bit here. But I wasn't expecting this cooler, this radiator. I'm not sure what it's for yet. I think it's probably the climate control system, but it's directly in my way because the valve block is right behind here. Here, in fact, is one of the air lines. It comes from the front right air strut. It goes down here and behind here. I can even put my hand on the valve block, but that's in my way and I don't think I can remove that very easily. So I think to get at the valve block, I'm going to have to remove this front bumper. What pain.